I have a personal connection to this panel. It's going to be moderated by my dad, Jason Hwang. It's a little bit exciting for me. But to introduce the panel, I'd like to invite Mike Jesperson, Strategic Development and Community Engagement Coordinator for Tie Rod Industries, to introduce this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Logan. Good morning, everyone. As Logan mentioned, my name is Mike Jesperson. I'm the Community Engagement Manager for Tie Rod Industries, proudly based here in Prince George. At Tie Rod, we specialize in the fabrication and installation of pressure piping, vessels, and structural steel, supporting a diverse range of clients across British Columbia in the oil and gas, mining, and marine sector. Today, we are privileged to sponsor this important panel discussion, Water is Life, and it is my pleasure to introduce you today to your moderator, Jason Hwang. Jason serves as Chief Program Officer with the Pacific Salmon Foundation, an organization renowned for its leadership in salmon conservation. Through initiatives focused on watershed restoration, marine habitat preservation, and community investment, the Foundation continues to make meaningful impacts on salmon ecosystems for today and for future generations to come. I had the pleasure of meeting Jason yesterday, and we had a brief but meaningful conversation around the importance of education and collaboration between industries and foundations such as his. I believe that by working together through early engagement, hopefully we can implement better designs and proper mitigations for our projects when working around these fragile habitats. This should ensure that our metrics for success are not only financial, but take into account how we protect, maintain, and perhaps one day enhance these fragile marine and aquatic ecosystems. Thank you very much, and please welcome me in joining Jason Hwang.
Well, thank you for that introduction. This is not my first time in Prince George. I've lived and worked here for about 10 years, but it's my first time at NRF. And when I came in to register. I drove up here from Kamloops, and I walked into the registration desk, and I still had my road kind of outfit on, you know, my jeans and my hoodie. And I walked in, and my son Logan saw me, and he's like, "That's what you're wearing?" I actually got sent back to my room to dress better for the opening banquet by my son. So, you know, you talk about humble beginnings to an event. That was my welcome to the NRF. I was sent back to my room. So it's my great pleasure today to be moderating this panel. It's Water is Life, and we're going to explore innovations, ideas, and opportunities around natural resource development, water use, and water sustainability. We're going to kind of run through this session just like most of the other panels have been. I'm going to make a few opening comments to set the stage, and then I'm going to turn to our panelists to introduce themselves, and we're going to get into some interesting discussion and questions. So I'd like to thank Lheidli for having us here today. I've had the great pleasure to have some chats with Chief Logan, and you know, I know from my time living here in Prince George how important the resources are to the people of this area. I'd also like to thank C3, our session sponsor, Tie Rod, for putting everything together to have us here. So I'm going to start with just a little bit about me. I worked for DFO for about 25 years. I was a regulator. I was one of those people that probably annoyed and frustrated some of you in the room, and probably worked with some of you in the room or some of your entities to solve problems and get things done. As I said, I've lived in Prince George. I live in Kamloops now. I've lived all around BC. I've done work in the Yukon, and I have a really good understanding of the natural resource development context that we undertake in this part of the world, in this part of Canada. So now I work with PSF. We basically try to do good things for salmon with anybody. And our door is wide open to working with any entity that wants to build positive things for salmon into their agenda, into their portfolio, and into their solutions ideas. So I'm going to turn now a little bit to setting some context for our panel today. This forum's about natural resources. The theme this year is purpose, partnerships, and prosperity. I would say salmon are one of the great natural renewable resources we have here in BC. They're very important to the people of British Columbia. They provide a lot of benefits to the people of British Columbia. And I'm just going to provide a little bit of context. Salmon have been affected by, like pretty much everything else in British Columbia, by things that we're attributing to climate change. Droughts, fires, floods. Things like that are compounding some of what I would call the normal challenges that we have in trying to sustain salmon on our landscape. Locally here, just for some context, when I started working up here, the early Stuart sockeye run up into Takla Lake area returned over 800,000 salmon in the mid-90s. That run has declined on my watch professionally in our time to the few thousands, and because of the Big Bar landslide, less than 100 came back last year. That's the state of salmon populations in some cases. But salmon are resilient, and there's good news out there too. In the Okanagan Nation Alliance has led rebuilding efforts, and in the late 90s, they had less than 10,000 sockeye coming back. And this year, because of their great work, more than 750,000 sockeye salmon of Yukon origin came back into Canada. Or came back into the Columbia, and many of them into Canada. So salmon are resilient and rebuilding is possible. And now I'm going to turn to something more specific and just tell you a little anecdote about salmon and water and development. If you remember 2023 in the summer, it was a hot, dry summer. We had a drought, it affected all of us. Where I live in Kamloops, there's a small stream, and I started watching it because the small stream is interesting. It's got a natural section, and then it's got a section that it flows through kind of an open footprint of a past development activity. It was hot. That stream, I watched the temperature go up, I watched the flows drop, I watched it turn into isolated pools in the developed section, and over the course of about a week, all the salmon, fry, and juvenile trout died in that section of stream. 50 meters upstream, where the stream still flowed through a natural area, the water was 10 degrees cooler, and the fish survived that summer hot period. And so that's context that brings us to natural resources and sustainability. I believe sustainability for things that depend on water is possible. I know from my firsthand experience working with the resource development sector and with First Nations and with government agencies that it's possible for us to use innovations and ideas and find solutions to some of these challenging problems. So that brings us to our panel today. Water is something we all need. It's intertwined with all of our natural resource industries, and it's inseparable from the needs of salmon in our aquatic ecosystems. So we've got a great panel today. I've had the pleasure of doing some preparatory work with our panelists, and I'm going to turn now to our panelists to give a short introduction to themselves and the work that they do. So Kari, I'll turn to you.
Thank you very much, Jason. My name is Kari Stuart-Smith, and I'm the Manager of Biodiversity and Wildlife for Canfor, and I'm very honored to be here today. I'm trained as a wildlife ecologist, but I've spent my entire career working in the forest industry, searching for innovative new approaches to biodiversity conservation and wildlife habitat management. I believe strongly that the best and most robust solutions are those that we develop in partnership with others. And so I focus on building diverse, collaborative teams to look for solutions to complex issues. I reside near Cranbrook in the traditional territory of the Ktunaxa.
Thanks, Kari. Andrew, over to you.
Okay, my name's Andrew Czornohalan, Director for Energy and Watershed Partnerships for Rio Tinto. My role incorporates management of the Nechako Reservoir and all of the Kamano hydro electric facilities, and then that feed to the aluminum smelter in Kitimat, and working very closely with all of the associated and affected communities in that region. And the primary part of that is working on water, working on how water is managed through the Nechako system, how water is managed into the Kamano River system. And we've been working on those partnerships, not only with First Nations, but with NGOs, with consultants, with the local communities, and even more recently, the partnerships with the University of Northern British Columbia in order to further our understanding and look for those innovative solutions. Similarly, I find that when we work together, we work on adaptive management strategies. We can work and adapt to the changing climate that we see, the changing conditions, and ultimately work to recover those ecosystems.
Thanks, Andrew. Russ.
Hi, thanks, and it's a true honor to be here. My name is Russ Brausse, and I'm the Senior Manager of Facilities, Construction, and Water for Ovintiv. Ovintiv is a North American E&P. We operate out of Texas, Oklahoma, Alberta, and British Columbia. And I'll just focus in, our Canadian operations run from just north of Dawson Creek, BC, and run through into GP, just south of GP and on the Alberta side. This is also known as the heart of the Montney resource play, as many of you guys know. A little bit about Ovintiv. We are responsible for roughly 20% of BC's annual gas production, and we've operated in the province for 50 years. At Ovintiv, we're committed to water stewardship. We understand the importance of water to our local and Indigenous communities, as well as to the wildlife, as well as our operations, as we use it for almost everything we do. We know that access to clean water is critical to our way of life, and we tailor our water management to local conditions, work with governments, regulatory, First Nations on our water plans, and I look forward to the conversation this morning.
Good. Thanks, Russ. And Chelton.
Hi, everyone. My name's Chelton van Geloven. I'm the Director of Lands and Natural Resources and Stewardship with the Lheidli First Nation. I'm a forester. I'm a hydrologist. I take a lead role in the forestry file with Lheidli, and I take a collaborative role on the fisheries, the lands, and the natural resources stewardship side of things. Yeah, I'm very honored to be here today. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'll keep my talking about myself to a minute and save it for what we have to talk about.
All right, well, thank you, panelists, for introducing yourselves. And I know that these panels run quickly, so I'd like to just jump right in to discussions around water, how industry or entities are working with and around water. And the first question that I'd like to pose is to talk about something innovative that you or your organization are doing. And I think we'd agreed to a speaking order, so Kari, I'll invite you to go first.
Thank you. I've got two innovations that I'd like to touch on today that Canfor is implementing in partnership with others. And both of these enable us to manage water and the values that water provides much better. Because we know that that water is absolutely critical for species like salmon, trout, and moose. And so the water in our wetlands, lakes, and streams, and that flows throughout our watersheds must be managed with great care. So our first innovation is managing variable width riparian management areas. And we're doing this in the East Kootenay region. And so this might sound a bit complex, but it's really very simple. Instead of the traditional approach to management, which is just applying a fixed width reserve to all creeks of the same class, so say take a linear strip of forest, maybe 30 meters wide, and reserve it on either side of all creeks of the same type, regardless of the type and amount of riparian forest on either side, we apply variable width buffers. And these can range in size from less than 10 to over 200 meters in size, depending on the shape of the floodplain, the amount of riparian forest adjacent to it, and the use of that forest by wildlife, such as moose. And we put boots on the ground to assess these features out there and help us develop site-specific prescriptions for these areas that are adjacent to our harvesting cut blocks. And this is really a win-win situation. It allows us, it is a much more ecologically based approach that allows us to better manage for the values that are on that site. And it also allows us to harvest timber on areas that are less sensitive. And importantly, it allows us to remove high fuel loading from areas that are at danger of burning very severely if a wildfire was to come into this area. And I'll speak more to that about a little bit later. But this approach has been approved in our forest stewardship plans by the Rocky Mountain Forest District and also supported by the Czornohalan Nation. And they're excited enough about this approach that they are now exploring changing their fixed width standards in their forest standards document to be more variable and dynamic as well. And we are privileged enough to work with Chelton and the Lheidli First Nation on the stewardship plans for their First Nations woodland license and are exploring the adoption of this same approach. So that's really exciting. And the second thing, if I've got just a couple seconds more, is at a watershed level. And here as well, we are moving away from the simplistic traditional approach of just using a single indicator to look at watershed health, to having professional hydrologists help us do comprehensive risk assessments that look at not only the amount of our proposed logging, but the distribution of that logging throughout the watershed and the type of logging we're proposing. Is it clear cut, partial cut, some sort of type of mixture between those two? And importantly, how is that logging projected to interact with proposed impacts in climate change, to impact flows on water? And depending on the results of that modeling, we can switch around what we're planning to do to mitigate our impacts. And we've reached out to other licensees operating in the same watersheds as us, such as BC Timber Sales and First Nation licensees, so that we can all work together if we are working in the same watershed. Because it simply makes no sense to have each licensee do a small assessment on one tiny portion of the watershed. We are all working together in the same watershed. We have to look holistically, and we have to work together in a very transparent and open fashion. So that's an exciting new development too. Thank you.
That's a great way to kick our innovation question off, Kari. And Russ, I'll turn to you next, and I'll say I didn't know a lot about Ovintiv's work, and I was really amazed when you, in our preparatory work, were starting to talk about some of the innovations. So I'll turn to you and let you have the floor.
Sure. At Ovintiv, we've recognized that water recycling, like recycling our produced water, is critical to sustainable success. It reduces our disposal needs. It reduces the induced seismicity that we see when we do dispose of water. It provides a reliable, consistent source of frack water for our frack operations. But most of all, it conserves fresh surface water. And so because of this, we've focused our innovation efforts recently, and specifically in my group, on trying to improve and increase the recycled water that we currently have. For the past 10 years, we've invested significant dollars into infrastructure, pipelines, facilities, above ground storage. But the biggest innovation on this front is we've used underground reservoirs for water storage. And so we have a fully closed loop in where we take water from our from our producing wells, and we flow it back through the pipelines to our water hub, and that's the central facilities, and we've got a few of these. At the water hub, you can filter the water and send it back to the completion spread for the new development wells. But at times when we have too much water that we can't store it all at the water hubs, we are now storing it underground in subsurface reservoirs. And we are the only company doing this. This gives us access to large volumes of water, so we are able to put the water down into our disposal wells, and at times when we need high rates for completion operations, we can now draw it out through our source wells out of the same reservoir and feed it to our completion spread. The other thing this has allowed us to do is we do not have any surface pits for produced water at Ovintiv, and we're also one of the few operators who can say that. This innovation has reduced our use of fresh water by the equivalent of around 1,000 households per year. Now that we have this large volume of water storage, the next challenge is how do we deliver this water to our frac spreads at rates sufficient for them to meet their on-demand needs? And so as the technology has improved over the past number of years, completions has needed more and more water. And so we've worked closely with our supplier to develop a friction reducer, which has increased our rates in the pipelines by 50%. So now we're able to deliver this water on demand at the rates we need. And this innovation has now reduced our surface water use by around 300 more households per year. The last thing is we're optimizing our frac operations in real time. And so historically what we would have done is we would have had a pre-prescribed completion plan sent out to site, and they would have just executed the site as directed, executed the development plan as directed. Now what we're doing is we've got live supervision of these completions with the central command center, and they're optimizing on the fly. So as the formation is taking water, they're able to tweak and dial down the volumes. And this innovation has now accounted for another 20% reduction in water. So as you add up all these things, we are moving towards our overall strategy of being able to use 100% recycled water on our fracs.
So let me just ask you a follow-up. As a non-technical person in that business line, but as somebody, I care about what's happening on the surface to the fish. So am I correct to say if you hadn't developed that innovation, you would have had to pull surface water from a pond or a lake or a stream in order to do your work, and you've essentially found a way to take a lot less of that?
Yeah, no, exactly. Historically, we would have been using 100% surface water going back 10, 15 years. And at that time, when we were really thinking of ways how we could ramp up production and when we were growing our Montney play, we had to think of innovative ways to be able to gain access to that volume of water. And then over the years, things have just continued to increase. So we've been reducing the surface impact, but the development subsurface has really expanded. So we're doing much more longer wells, and in some cases they're even doing U-turn wells under the ground, which just turns out to be a more intensive completion frac, which requires more water. So it's less surface disturbance, but much more water is required.
Well, that's amazing. And as a fish guy, I just think that's got to be a good thing, in terms of finding ways to have the resource sector have what it needs, and also sustaining natural resources that live alongside. So thank you, Andrew. I think, as you know from our introductory meeting, I've had a background working. Well, it was Alcan, and then it was Rio Tinto Alcan. So I understand, at least from my time, the Nechako system, and I've been following along. And I know there's been a lot going on in terms of water and innovation. So the floor is over to you.
Yeah, look, thanks. I think when I first thought about innovation, my mind as someone from an engineering background is to go to, what are the cool technologies that we're deploying? What are the cool instruments we're using? But the more I reflected on this, the more I reflected on the topic of the conference, I actually think the biggest innovation that we've worked to implement is our mindset around partnerships and how we work with those partners, including regulators and including sort of the hard and fast ways in which our water is governed and the way in which our water license prescribes how water is released. The old way of thinking was very much that, there's fixed targets, temperature targets, flow targets, all kinds of targets at different time of the year, and the engineers in us all would rigorously adhere to those targets. And over time, we heard feedback, we heard concerns raised about, that rigorous application to targets, which, have been favored by DFO for, generations now, were having adverse effects. And so what we did is we started to work with First Nations, we started to work with communities, and then we started to work with sort of local consultants that are actually really connected to those rivers. And we've even worked with Chelton on some of that work as well, to really understand what are the ways we can adaptively manage the targets. What are the ways we can actually perhaps be more flexible around them to achieve more ecological outcomes, to achieve something that is perhaps a more naturalized system than thinking about those flow targets. That partnership thinking has then moved into, well, maybe we can work with the University of Northern British Columbia, UNBC, and that's sort of that work that we spoke about yesterday, the announcement we made yesterday to fund the research chairs as opposed to going to sort of, consultants to deliver work for us. What we're doing then is we also have the benefit of integrating students into the watershed, seeing that connection, seeing those ecosystems, and we're creating a local knowledge base. So for me, that has all helped us inform our business decisions. It's helped us inform flow management decisions, and ultimately we're coming back with win-win-win solutions through those partnerships. And that for me is probably the innovation I'm most proud of.
Well, as a guy that used to be the regulator, just let me ask a follow-up. How have the regulators responded to that?
It's been a journey, I can tell you. It's a safe space to be. If you've got a temperature target or a flow target, either you're meeting it or you're not. And it's easy to regulate and then penalize, or regulate and leave you alone. As we've moved into these discussions, though, we've brought the regulators along in those discussions, and their minds are opening to it. And ultimately, we're seeing a lot more latitude in that space. And at a point in time, we may need to deal with some of the hard legalities and some of the hard regulations in an innovative way. But we're on that journey. We're not there yet.
Well, I love that response. I like that it's around what your new thinking is opening possibilities, your new approaches, and I think that's fantastic. Chelton, you and I have intersected many different ways in our work time, and you now have your new portfolio with Lheidli, so we'll turn to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason. So an innovation that I want to talk about is, it's kind of a journey that we've taken with Lheidli today. So, since 2016, we brought together a whole bunch of partners. We brought together landowners, we brought together provincial government, federal government, so DFO, regional government, so the regional district, local government, NGOs, academia, I've got 9, there's quite a few, other nations, as well as industry. And to try to figure out, what's going on with the Chilako River. We've got a river where the salmon stocks are rapidly dwindling. It was a good salmon river, and it kind of went down to about 200 spawners, and now it's kind of hovering around like between 6 and 20 spawners each year. And so the salmon stocks are dwindling, and the riverbanks are eroding at an absolutely alarming rate. So, we took a remote sensing approach to understand the problem. So we considered historic air photos, LiDAR, satellite information, drone information, and then verified it with field visits. And what we learned is that this river, land clearing happened in the 1920s and 1930s, and when they did that, they left some vegetation along the side of the river, but 100 years went by, and the river's wiggled out of that vegetation, and now the riparian area is essentially the clumps of sod that fall off the pasture land into the river. So in 2016, we did our first demonstration. We attempted some soil bioengineering techniques, so basically planting willows in different ways with the intention to establish floodplain vegetation on the riverbanks and to slow soil erosion. Together, by restoring vegetation, the idea is that, in time, we would start to recreate the processes that lead to high quality fish habitat. So, so we did this, we practiced it, we demonstrated it, we monitored it, we kept on collaborating. In 2020, we received a substantial injection from Watershed's BC. And when we got that cash injection, we were able to scale up and approach the problem, at an appropriate scale. So what we understood about the river, is that in our study section, it was about 20% shorter than it was in 1946. So that's the earliest air photo record we had. The river was about 4 times wider than it used to be. It's 4 times wider. There's very, very few deep pools. They're few and far between. There's very, very little wood in contact with water. And temperatures are definitely going up quite a bit. So I gotta go to my notes here. I've got too many things on the go. Right, and the other key indicator is that riparian vegetation was impaired along 70 kilometers of riverbank. So once we got our cash injection, we scaled up, and we took a really, really industrial approach to soil bioengineering along the riverbanks. Where we've got to now is we've sort of strategically located over 5 kilometers of riverbank restoration. We've reactivated over 5 kilometers of abandoned side channels. We've seen that our bioengineering demonstrations are very attractive to rearing fish, and especially juveniles, including juvenile Chinook. and that the beavers have come in and taken over our reactivated side channels. They're bringing the water table up in the floodplain and essentially reconnecting the floodplain to the river.
Well, as a fish guy, I think, to me, what I take away from things like that are we have new kinds of problems, we need new kinds of solutions, but in the face of climate change and the challenges we have, there are things that we can do that are showing success, and you and your team and your collaborators are showing that. And I think that's the art of the possible and art of what we need to be doing into the future. So I love that as introductory comments. Time always races by when you're up here at one of these things. I'm going to kind of lump two of the questions, and I'll invite panelists to kind of pick either one or both parts. The next thing we were going to talk about is challenges and opportunities. So we've talked about innovations you are doing, and we've done a little bit of thinking around challenges or opportunities that we see. So I'll just shake up the speaking order here, and Andrew, maybe I'll go to you first for that.
Look, I think the biggest challenge that we're seeing at the moment is the changing climate. We're seeing unprecedented rainfall events, unprecedented droughts. We're seeing, right now we've got snowpacks at 56% of long-term average for the third year in a row. We're seeing unpredictability in these systems, and ultimately for me, that represents, turns into the biggest opportunity. And for me, progressing that climate change science, working with nations to understand the land, working to understand what the future could be, and starting to think about perhaps scenario analysis and not being comfortable in the way that we've always done business, not being comfortable in the way that decisions have always been taken, I think is a big opportunity for us. And none of us have the answers at the moment, but the only way we're going to figure it out is by working together, working with nations and being on the land. And I think to Chelton's point, sometimes those most simple innovations, those simple connections are actually having, real tangible impacts on these ecosystems.
Yeah, thanks. One of my colleagues talks about, if you are driving a car, you don't look in the rearview mirror to say where you were. You have to look out the windshield. What's coming at us, and what are we going to do about it?
No, I think that's exactly right, and it's a difficult space to operate in, and I think that's where we need to work together, collaborate, and innovate in that space.
Russ, why don't I turn to you? Challenges and/or opportunities.
Yeah, I think like in theme with what I was saying earlier is we're consistently trying to recycle more water and use more produced water opposed to using surface water for our completions. One thing that we're working on right now is the ability to move more water on the surface using temporary surface lines. And so right now we are able to do that in BC. However, the permitting process that you go through for that is the same as what you do for a permanent pipeline. And so it takes over a year, sometimes up to 2 years. If we could get these permits approved quicker, that would just give us the agility to move, to follow our ever-changing development plans. It would give us the ability, just to again, recycle more water. If I can compare to what they're doing over on the other side of the border in Alberta, they've recently made some changes to their Directive 77. And what they've done is they've really streamlined the approval process for any of the temporary surface pipelines. And their ability now is to turn these permits around in around 30 days, which gives operators such as ourselves the ability to really be dynamic, make changes on the fly, and use more produced water than we would have in the past. So if BC can fall in line and do something similar to what they're doing in Alberta, I think it would help a lot.
So they're doing something right next door. They're showing that it's possible, and it's something that we could bring here that would help unlock opportunity.
Yeah.
Kari, challenges or opportunities? I know you've got lots in your hamper, but take a run at a couple.
Yeah, the forest industry is certainly facing a tremendous amount of challenges right now, but I'd have to agree with Andrew that the biggest one we are facing has to do with climate change, and particularly with respect to water. And the traditional solution to this has just been to draw a line around things and just say, right, let's leave it alone and let's protect it. But my experience over the past 10 years, walking through ash up to my knees, with the severe fires that are just increasing in severity and extent every year shows that that is simply not working. And yet we know from monitoring done by the BC Wildfire Service and by universities, fire ecologists and others, that we can go in and do thinning treatments and surface fuel reduction treatments that can decrease fire behavior and the severity of fire in areas. And so if we can do those treatments in watersheds and adjacent to riparian areas and non-sensitive areas, we can reduce the severity and reduce the sediment going into those creeks, so we will not have as significant impacts on the fish and the aquatic life. So I think we really need to think outside the box and look at some of those innovative solutions going forward.
And Chelton, challenges and opportunities.
You know, one of the biggest challenges is like when we talk about these kind of really complex, you know, interjurisdictional problems is actually understanding what the problem is itself, like what's driving the problem, and then what there is to do about it. You know, when we go back to the example I shared earlier about the Chilako, you know, there's an example where, you know, you've got a project, you know, that, you know, it's well on its way to being solved. You know, the fish are using it, you know, and it's tangible. So, you know, I think one of the biggest opportunities is habitat banking, and I think it's something that's well worth activating. You know, it's difficult for people to invest in trying to solve a problem. Like, it's a little bit easier to invest in a solution once it's there, but when you got to solve the problem and then solve it, and it takes time and it takes partnerships, you know, everyone's got to work together. And, you know, so that's regulators, that's the nations, that's industry, you know. But when the fish and wildlife agree that they're getting the ecosystem services, you know, that are intended for that area, you know, wouldn't it be good, you know, for that just to be available, you know, to somebody and have it be in the habitat bank, you know, that someone can buy, you know, that project, and it would ultimately lead to funding the next one.
Right, well, thanks. I think I'll give you all a heads up. I'll turn to you like maybe for a 60-second closing comment at the end, but maybe we'll turn to the Whova screen here and start to pick a few questions. I'll use moderator's prerogative and maybe go to the second one on the list to start. And it's with recent activities of First Nations in protecting their watersheds and fishing rights, how can industry best respond and pivot to support First Nations in these efforts? And I think you know, through some of the opening comments, we've touched on that. But Andrew, do you want to take a kick at that with some of the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think the best thing that we can do to support First Nations is firstly work with First Nations. Building those relationships takes time, and it's probably one of the biggest things I'll call out to industry in the room and to those who are in the room, that, you know, it's really easy to look for, you know, traditional ways of, we've got a problem, let's go solve the problem. But what we learnt, and we learnt the hard way, is in order for those conversations to happen, you first need to build a relationship and trust within the nations, with the technical resources, with the leadership tables, and ultimately with the communities. And through building that trust, through building that understanding, and it moves past ecological performance, you need to understand what the nation's interests are. How do they want to reconnect, re-engage with that watershed? How do they envision their community using those waters and those lands? With that, you can start to work on innovative solutions. You can start to work on projects together that have these win-win-win outcomes. So that, for me, I think is absolutely critical, is building that relationship, understanding interest, understanding the needs, understanding the community, and then ultimately moving to implementation of solutions.
Can I just ask you a quick follow-up on that? You work for or with a giant multinational corporation. So if you work for a British Columbia-based entity, I think at that point would be easy to convince, you know, your board of directors, because they would understand the context. How hard is it when you work for an entity that has international kind of scope and scale to make a point like that and get support to be able to do it?
Look, that is an excellent question. I think it's a fantastic window into the journey that we've been on as an organisation. explained this to a number of people over the last couple of days. One of the things I am proud of is that my leadership has been willing to go on that journey with us. We've had to accept some risk. We've had to take some bold steps, and I've had a room full of lawyers on one side going, you don't want to open that, you don't want that genie to get out of the bottle. I'm going, look, if we don't, I think it's going to represent a bigger risk to us. So ultimately, there's been a few times where, we have that sense that we're out on a limb, and a few times that we've, been met with a little bit of skepticism in, whether it's Montreal or London or wherever. But ultimately, I think, certainly in my organization, there's leaders wanting to think different about that. They've been open to think different about how we work with nations and how we take risks that may have not been the traditional approach. And I've been incredibly supported. But it is a journey. You do need to take those leaders on that journey as well.
That's really insightful. It's nice to have kind of a window into what it's like on that side of things. I'm going to turn to another question here, just to kind of give some of the audience input some attention. The one around innovations in water stewardship that are happening in other jurisdictions. And the questions about could be explored in northern BC, but I'd let the panel answer whatever relative scope there is. But do you see innovations in other jurisdictions that you think we could be bringing in here? Kari, do you want to take a shot at that one?
Yeah, sure, I'll jump in. I think from my work in Alberta particularly, I see some things there that we could be doing a little bit differently here. I mean, obviously, different jurisdictions both have their strengths and weaknesses, but in terms of sediment and erosion control, I think that there are some things that we could learn from Alberta. And for example, in Alberta, many forest companies along the foothills there use what's called the FRIA funding, which is actually stumpage monies that they pay to governments, but they get a portion back in which they can spend on conservation projects or forestry projects. They are using that money to monitor all of their watercourse crossings. And then the crossings that have the most sediment being deposited into creeks, those ones are rehabilitated and fixed. And so that's actually been operating over the past 20 years or so and has really improved water management along the foothills. And Alberta is now developing a provincial watercourse management program building upon that. And so I think there's some lessons there that BC could learn, both in terms of sort of the policy setup as well as the budgeting.
Thanks. Russ, I know you talked about something earlier about Alberta. Would there be anything else you would bring to the table from the Ovintiv perspective?
I would say that from what I see and what we're doing in BC, we can be proud of our business. When I compare to other jurisdictions, and specifically south of the border, in terms of our spill prevention, wildlife conservation, surface storage, I think we are leading the pack and really leading the way in BC, and we can be proud and have pride in what we're doing. And so, aside from a few of those things that I mentioned on the Alberta side in terms of permitting, I think in general we're doing a really good job. And when I compare to, specifically south of the border, I think we can be proud.
And Chelton, we're kind of winding down on our time. Do you want to comment on that one at all? I know you've got a really diverse background, or if you wanted to pick one of the other ones off the Hoover board there, I'll give you a free license to do that.
No, sure. Well, I might just run a thread through kind of what everyone said, and I really acknowledge Russ's commitment to sort of minimizing surface disturbance, and with managing water. Like in the north, keeping vegetation on the landscape is so critical. When we think about things we've learned from other jurisdictions, we've certainly learned that we need to think about streams and rivers as corridors, and a lot of that kind of knowledge has come from the United States. So when we think of Kari talking about variable width buffers, it's not about a thread of water with a little bit of vegetation on each side. It's about recognizing where water moves and then what it needs to have a functioning ecosystem around it. This idea of like re-wetting corridors, like when we think of climate change, we think of land use change. What happens when you get floods? They move a lot more sediment. Channels get wider, and all that sediment kind of deposits in the lower parts of the river, and then it's really hard for fish to get through. So this whole idea of reconnecting your floodplains, getting vegetation back into it, getting it re-wetted, working with beavers, like working with the biology that's there that held things together, that's the kind of innovation I think that needs to go forward.
All right, well, that's probably a great segue to me giving each panelist, say, 60 seconds or less for a closing comment. So, Kari, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I've got two key messages that I would like to leave people with. The first is that there's no one simple prescription that is going to solve the issues in forestry around riparian and watershed management. Simply leaving large buffers around all of our small streams, for example, is not going to guarantee that fish will thrive, nor will just sticking to one watershed indicator and setting aside a watershed from development. We need to work together on collaborative and innovative solutions and have the flexibility to implement those solutions on the ground. And second, it is really critical in this time of a changing climate and so many complex problems that we have all hands on deck. The forest industry has a tremendous amount of experience and expertise and visionary and creative thinkers. And we need to be allowed a seat at the table early on in the process so that we can contribute to things like the forest landscape planning process, the land use objectives, the GAR orders, again, early on, before the cake is baked, so to speak. And in doing so, as Minister Neal said this morning, we will contribute to the diversity of voices and robust, sustainable solutions.
Thanks. Andrew?
So look, from my side, I think, water is life. It's in the title. The challenges around water stewardship, around watershed management, and ultimately connecting communities with those are real. The only way we're going to continue to improve the situation is through collaboration, through partnerships, and it's going to require regulators to come together with nations, to come together with NGOs, to come together with universities, learning organizations, and think innovatively. We have to challenge the status quo. We have to think collaboratively, and we have to think about things in a way that, may be uncomfortable, but ultimately is going to lead to improvements in these systems. I think that's what we have to take away.
Thanks. Russ?
Yeah, I think in terms of continuing to develop our resources responsibly, I can see great strides being made in our industry on increasing the development subsurface and reducing the development on the surface and reducing those impacts. And I just see that continuing over the next number of years. So what that results in is the need for higher rates and larger volumes of water at individual occupations. And so I guess just continued collaboration with regulatory, government, First Nations, and everybody involved to try and innovate, develop new ways of delivering that water, and so that we can all benefit.
Thanks, Russ. And Chelton?
Good. Yeah, so echoing everything that everybody just said, I think the only thing I'd really add is, there's a real importance to using remote sensing, to using satellite data to monitor change in watersheds, because it's so much about water quantity, water quality, and how streams are responding to land use change. The other part is when you start to fix things, you can also see, you can see the habitat come back. So there's ways to kind of keep track of things and learn.
Right, well, it's been my great pleasure to moderate this panel. I've learned a lot in preparing and meeting you all, and I'd like to ask the room to give the panelists a round of applause for this, and I'll turn it back to C3.